I know talking with Grant that he said you guys don't have any gang people at the department to share their kind of research and study. So I thought I kind of focus on some of that. I've been studying street gangs now for close to 10 years, I think. I went to the graduate school at University of California, Irvine, and did my dissertation looking at gangs in East Los Angeles. And so it's kind of my general background of studying gangs is in kind of one of the large urban centers where there's a lot of gang activity. Coming here to Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, I've done some research here, just kind of looking at more general patterns of crime. So I'll kind of talk about some of those things and then kind of where things have kind of shifted now in my life of kind of looking at far right, white power, alt-right, what me and my colleague Shannon Reed call alt-right gangs, trying to look at some of that possible data and trying to see what you can do with that spatially. So anyways, let's go ahead and kind of get started. Now, let's see if I can move you. How do we? Come on. All right, there we go. Sorry, just what I kind of just said. So I'm going to kind of lead into just some like different examples of things you can kind of do with ARC, and then kind of get into some studies later. But I fortunately, like I said, I did my research looking at gangs in East Los Angeles. I ended up having an advisor who had a really good relationship with LAPD at that time. And so he had done a lot of research there, and he'd actually done research in East Los Angeles. The community policing area, or the division is called Hollenbeck. It's just, you'll see some maps in a minute, but it's just east of the LA River. But when I was there, it's kind of the interesting thing about police departments, if you ever end up doing research for a police department, is that it's kind of like a fortress in the sense that it's really tough to get in the fortress, but once you're in the fortress, people don't really bother you when you're there. And so we were collecting a bunch of data there, got a really good relationship with one of the homicide lead detectives. He's also a gang detective for a while. And so having that relationship, I was able to get a lot of resources from them. And so a couple of things was every division maps their gang territories. Some divisions better than others, but I was able to get all of these basically PDFs of maps of their gang territories. And so that's wonderful, right? You have this PDF, you can kind of see where things are, but you can't really do anything with that unless you can digitize it. Right. So having kind of these skills in GIS where you can basically take a look at this map and kind of figure out, okay, well, where is that? Unfortunately, with LA, you have a lot of streets, a lot of it's kind of grid oriented. So it makes it kind of easy to kind of replicate and draw that. And so the two maps I'll show you here are kind of just two divisions in LA. And you can kind of get a sense here of looking, there's a lot of overlap between these territories. There's a lot of just kind of messiness, right? And so when you're trying to come up with a map, trying to figure out how can I show all the information possible, but still make it meaningful for the viewer, right? And so you can kind of get a sense here where, I typically tend to label all of the gang territories because at some point, you only have so many color option variations. And so at some point you have to reuse a color or something. I mean, even this map here is quite busy, right? Because there's just so many gangs and they're just so on top of each other that it's really tough to kind of show that differentiation. But then also you can kind of see the lighter gray color around those areas. Those are other divisions, right? So LA has 21 divisions. So you can get a sense, okay, those are LAPD boundaries. And then the darker gray areas, those are actually outside the city of LA. So it just, if you kind of look at this, you can kind of get a sense of just where everything is at. Obviously you have a highway that goes through part of the map too. And you can even see right next to the highway, you can see I have like a little image of like what the little police station icon. I don't generally like using the icons that ARC gives us, but sometimes there's exceptions. So this kind of shows you an example, and then this is a follow-up. So this is Rampart. You might be more familiar with that police division, given its little sordid history. But again, you can see this is actually surrounded all by different different LAPD divisions. So there's no like county kind of going through. But here again, you can kind of see there's less the territories. You know, there's a lot fewer of them. There's a lot less overlap, so it's a little clear to kind of see where those boundaries aren't. So, and feel free to also feel free to ask questions or anything during any of this. If anything comes up, just jump in and ask it or whatever. I'm not going to be offended. So, so again, these are things where it's a little combination. So all the gang territories I had to digitize. All the other features are things that are able to be downloaded, right? So the street layers, the highway layers, the boundary layers for the reporting districts, those are provided by LAPD. So all of those things, you know, you're just adding it and kind of coloring and doing what you want to it. But all the other stuff had to make on your own. So, kind of moving on to the main area that I've studied, Hollenbeck. This was kind of a fun map. So LA has neighborhoods that they actually have like a giant, I don't want to say it's a neighborhood association, but they have basically a listing of all the neighborhoods that exist, places that consider themselves to be neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And in Hollenbeck, there was, according to their map, there was only 4. So it had been Boyle Heights, which is the orange, Lincoln Heights in purple, Montecito Heights yellow, and El Sereno in green. But when you go to the community policing meetings, the residents actually identified with other areas in Hollenbeck that considered them to be like their own separate neighborhoods than kind of what LA put out there. And so it ends up being 8. So like the orange, the brown area, University Hills, that's actually where Cal State Los Angeles is located. In there, and a couple of the other northern areas in blue and red are kind of more gentrified areas. And so this again had a much different identity as far as being there. But this was kind of just a fun map I did because when you're actually in Los Angeles, you kind of think of it as a kind of a generally flat area, but there is a lot of hills. And so actually the northern part of LA is quite hilly. And so you can kind of see the neighborhood boundaries kind of coalesce in the north with kind of some of that 3D terrain. So for this, I was able to bring in like a 3D base layer map and then just kind of overlay it with the neighborhoods. And again, most of those were files that were pulled. The 4 smaller neighborhoods, I had to digitize those, right? Those did not exist. But you can kind of get just a sense of kind of the topography. And I believe this is at like what's it called? Transparency, right? You can turn your transparency on for any shape file you have to make it kind of look clear. So you can kind of see that terrain them through instead of it just being a dark shape file on top of it. So again, just something else to kind of play around with and kind of, again, trying to show kind of where these neighborhoods dissect, where they show up, whatnot. So then kind of moving on. So when I was in Hollenbeck, the gang territories are what we kind of see on the right-hand side there, the 2014. So I did my research from, when did I graduate? 14. So like, I think we started in 2010, collecting data. So that's basically, they had just done an audit. So that's kind of what the TERFs were in 2010. And then kind of just looking at different resources, finding stuff online, different things. There was a bunch of posts about old gang maps of Hollenbeck that had been kind of procured. And so there was one I found from 1978. And so trying to get a sense of just how those TERFs may have changed and shifted over time. So this just kind of shows that shift and change from gangs that existed in 1978 to the gangs in 2014. And the one thing that's kind of interesting with LA is a lot of these gangs have been around for quite a long time. There's some gangs that can trace the roots back for over 100 years. So that's not to say you got like grandpa walking around with his cane yelling at the little kids, right? We don't have that, but the neighborhood identity that these gangs kind of connect with, right? So when they're saying, someone's gonna ask you where you're from, it's the neighborhood and the gang are kind of melded into one thing. It's kind of hard to pull the two apart in a lot of these places. But you can kind of get a sense that a lot of these areas where these gangs have, there's been some fluctuation in maybe the size of the turf or maybe where the center point would be, but they generally kind of are pretty consistent. There's a lot of relative stability over time as far as where they're kind of located. Particularly like if you look at 10, which is El Sereno, 6, which is Clover, White Fence, which is still pretty big. I mean, they kind of shifted down a little bit. Big Hazard, number 3, they're kind of in the middle, really consistent. And so, again, this just kind of gives you a sense of making a map where you can kind of see those comparisons, right? And trying to make one table of contents, right? So again, that when you're looking at these things, it's just really easy for the viewer to kind of see those matchups, like matching up the colors, all of that type of stuff.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah. Sure, go ahead.
Sorry to jump in. I often find gangs fascinating because a lot of times the aspect of the business a gang is in, not just violence, but like where they draw their resources, gives a lot of personality to the gangs. Is that taken into consideration in the mappings, the resources that they take? And to kind of move on with that, do you see overlap in the resources of certain gangs and competition with others?
Sure. I'll get to a map later. Like I kind of have I map both the social and spatial components of the gangs together. Because I mean, a lot of these gangs do have rivalries with each other that have kind of been around for a while. As far as it comes to like resources, again, kind of looking at these, I mean, there is a lot of stability, right? I mean, so I mean, granted, this is like almost a 40-year window, right? So I mean, there is some shifting of boundaries, but for the most part, a lot of the turfs are actually pretty stable. A few of the gangs kind of fade out over time, but so for instance, if you look on the map on the right, number 16, it's a kind of a goldish yellow color. So those are the crazy ass Mexicans. CAM is what they are known as, but that's what CAM stands for. So they actually kind of became kind of a big deal right around when my advisor was there. So it would have been like the mid 90s. And they started off as a tagging crew and basically wanted to kind of join up with a local gang. And the gang was like, yeah, we're not interested. And so they just started shooting everyone. And then when you actually look at the network for the rivalries, they have one of the highest in degrees, or just degree in general. So they have the most rivalries of any other gang because they wanted to make a name for themselves and like, you know, make themselves a big deal. And so the two turfs that overlap that 29 and 25, those are really small gangs. They're still there in the sense like there are members that are still get the police stop and talk to or whatever, but like they're not really active in the sense of some other groups, right? So it's like one of those things where it's like probably like a ghost turf. Like there's not anyone actually defending it or per se, you know, trying to like maintain it. It's just kind of like we still hang out here, kind of, right? Or maybe people come by on the weekend. So there is a relative amount of mobility for gangs here. So again, because these neighborhoods are so permanent, people might move away and live somewhere else, but like they still will come back on the weekend and hang out and see their friends and visit. And so like, again, the neighborhood and the turf get really kind of tied down. So it is really kind of tough. Because again, and you'll see this in the, I'll go to the next map because this is like my creme de la creme map. I actually had this on my wall for the longest time. But this is like every kind of thing you can put into one giant map. So like this is like my pride and joy. So on the top left, you can see these are all the divisions of LA. They're color coded by the bureau they're in. So Hollenbeck, you can see, has the yellow border and the dark red. So it's in the Central Bureau. It's the easternmost one. Obviously, in the middle, you have the full gang map with an actual street image below. So you can kind of get a sense of like what the city actually looks like. On the top right, then you have the neighborhood map, which we just have. So you can kind of get a sense of where that would fall in. And then because I was studying gang injunctions, kind of the other big map then is where those gang injunctions are, right? With the color codes based on the colors that would correspond with them in the regular gang map. So if you look at the big gang map, you can kind of see, it's kind of tough here just because there's so much, but there's some little like dark gray hash areas. So for instance, in Big Hazard, the brown one, you can kind of see it in the right corner there. Those, if you see that there'd be four of those areas, those are actually public housing areas, right? And so if you look to the left, where Primera Flats in yellow, TMC in purple, and Quattro Flats in green, you can see on that kind of the highway there, which is the 101, between the 101 and the LA River, that's all public housing. That's actually the largest public housing area west of the Mississippi. And it more recently got torn down and rebuilt, right? Because again, it was just such a violent prone area. The thing is, those gangs still claim that area. Like, they've all left. Like, maybe you might have new people that have, like, you know, even though they try to prohibit gang membership in those new communities, then they just come back, right? So it's really kind of tough to say, like, oh, we're just going to like gentrify this area, tear down all these projects, and like, well, that's great, but like, they still consider that part of their neighborhood. Like, they're just going to come back on the weekend and hang out. They might not be able to get inside the full area. Maybe they just hang out on the outskirts or in the park that's next door, but like, they're still there. And there's still violence that ends up happening. So space does kind of become, you know, this resource that, you know, it's really tough for it to kind of change hands and shift, kind of just being the way it is for so long, at least again, in Los Angeles. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, my mic was off. Yeah, it does. I'm still quite interested in like the idea, like when you were looking at Chicago earlier, there's certain gangs of the past that had businesses. I mean, whether that was in gambling, prostitution, or in prohibition. I'm curious as to, you know, what is the modern equivalent of their resource, you know, equivalents? Are they the same? Are they different? I mean, obviously drugs, things like that, but it would be neat to see what resources on a map that they're drawing from, I guess. You know, where they get their prime sources of income.
So with the gangs in Los Angeles, I mean, I can speak for Hollenbeck because that's the area I know the most. You have some there's a few gangs. So I know talking with detectives like State Street. So that's the gang that's kind of in the center, dark blue. Like, they were, you know, of the gangs that sold drugs, they had the market on, I think it was PCP that they were selling, amongst other things. But when it really comes down to it, it's not so much the gang that's doing the activity, it's members in the gang, right? So what happens is, you know, the gang is not getting a profit from the people selling the drugs. It's just what happens is that there might be a group of a clique within that gang, you know, a couple friends, and like they have a drug selling business and they just happen to be State Street gang members. So what happens is the gang is kind of providing them with this umbrella of protection, because as long as they're selling in their turf, no one's going to bother them from an outside gang for the most part, right? Or if they are, they're going to take on that risk of dealing with that gang, right? But those profits aren't moving up to everyone. It's not like a giant collection pod and like they're all being shared, right? It's that clique within it. And that's generally how a lot of these things kind of translate to. It's not so much the gang itself getting this benefit, it's cliques within those gangs that might be doing certain things. As far as like anything there, I mean, there might be some more sophisticated things that are going on, but generally speaking, I mean, most of these are, you know, East Los Angeles, it's a very big Mexican American community, like Boyle Heights. So again, if you look at the top right, the neighborhoods, that's 95% Mexican American. It's like over 80% Latinx. So you know, a lot of these gangs are kind of that traditional territorial, turf-based, reputational type thing. They're not kind of doing anything major. At least that's nothing like that was kind of coming up. It's just kind of typical street violence and, you know, minor drug things here and there. But again, it's nothing more elaborate than that.
Yeah, it's less organized than like the 1920s is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's definitely not hierarchical at all. There's no like structured, you know, what happens is you might have a person in the neighborhood that is what they call an OG, you know, original gangster, or veterano, someone that has like some clout, but like whether or not you listen to that person or not, like there's no one to kind of enforce those rules. You know, it's kind of just the reputation of like, oh, this person's respected. They're telling me not to do this. I probably shouldn't do it. But like, again, you could step off and maybe some consequence will happen to you. But so.
Cool. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. So anyways, so again, this is like, you know, 4 different maps in one. Again, I was pretty proud. I mean, you know, when we got this at Kinko's, I got it laminated, you know. If I could move my camera, it's on my door now because I have too much stuff in my office now to have it where it was. But anyway, so if we kind of move on, we'll move on here. But you can see the gang injunction map on the right. Kind of a better way of looking at this then with those gang territories is this way. And this kind of moves into doing things with buffers. So I'm not sure if have you guys done that yet? Okay. So this would just be making polygon buffers. So if you're not familiar with what an injunction is, basically a gang injunction is prohibiting gang members from a targeted gang from doing certain activities. And the biggest one of those is associating in public together with another gang member. So if you're caught associating in public within the confines of the safety zone, that's in this case, the dashed buffers, you can get fined, you can get arrested, and basically, because it's civil, it can be done in civil court, which requires much fewer prescriptions. You don't have to have a defense lawyer. It moves really quickly. And so it's kind of a way that the criminal justice system figured out a way of like trying to have these punishments meted out pretty quickly. And again, there's a lot of contention over, again, their use and stuff, and they've generally kind of fallen off quite a bit for lots of different reasons. But you can kind of see here, one of the first injunctions is V&E, which is the pink one in the bottom. And you can kind of see the boundaries of those are really, they line up with the boundary lines of the division really well. And if you look at all the other ones that came later, except for CAM, they all have the kind of like an overhang, right? And so what happened with these injunctions was that they used to be based on street segments as far as kind of aligning with those gangs' turfs. But if you're a gang member, right, and you're not allowed to associate with each other in public, well, if you just cross the street, you're outside the buffer, right? So like you could be like giving the cops like the finger and like doing like they can't really do anything to you because you're just loitering, right? Like that's not a crime. It's only a crime when you're in the zone and you're that gang member. And so what happened was with all the injunctions kind of as they matriculated out after the 2000s, they all say 50 feet beyond this thing. And so in ARC, it's really easy. You can incorporate that when you make your buffer. You can say, I want a 50-foot thing around my polygon, and then it will draw it for you. And boom, you have this really easy way of kind of making these polygons for it. So again, just kind of a way of showing it. The 4 lower injunctions are all on single gangs. The top one has 3 gangs in its injunction, which that's a whole other can of worms to kind of deal with. But again, you can kind of get a sense of just how these things kind of look like and that tool. Probably a tool that you use more often with buffers is points. So here again, these are all the hangout locations. So these are spots that either were known to LAPD or were kind of documented in interactions with gang members, as far as these are being known gang hangouts. In the literature, they're called set space, but it's just basically places that you'd expect gang members to hang out. So again, just it's really easy. You have an address or a street, you can just geocode those, right? Boom, they're on the map as dots. And then you can just kind of play around with it. So these, I ended up just making little buffers around those so you can kind of see them better on the map, and then just color coding the hangouts based on, again, the gang that they correspond with. So you can kind of just get a sense here too, where some of these gangs that have really big turfs, they're not actually in all of that turf, right? You're more than likely going to find them out at one of these hangouts than just like randomly walking around in their turf location. So it does kind of, when you show these maps to people, I worked with applied mathematicians at UCLA when I was in grad school. And so like I take them into Hollenbeck in the morning and just drive around, we grab lunch there. And like they were like prepared for like a demilitarized zone or something, right? Like, and it's just like, they're like, this is like a neighborhood. It's like, well, yeah, it's just like only like 10% of the people here might be gang members, if that. Like, it's not that a lot of people. It's like, it's just a normal neighborhood, right? Just don't go to one of these hangouts in the middle of the night and you'll be fine, right? If you're driving around at 10 a.m., all the gang guys are sleeping. Like, you just go get your hamburger or your flauta and have a nice lunch and enjoy yourself. So, but again, this just kind of shows those. Another way, these are triple ring buffers. So again, if you're zooming in an area and you kind of want to highlight those things, this kind of just shows you, I think it's 50, 100 feet from the centroid. So again, you can just kind of get a sense of, okay, if this is where these people are, if you had other crimes, police stops, whatever, you can kind of get a sense of like how close would you be to a location. So another way of kind of visualizing these things, this is kind of a variety of buffers and points. So again, so you can kind of see a lot here. This is just one gang, big hazard. Again, we have the injunction around where the gang is at. We have the gang turf. Then we have all of the hangouts, which are the buffered circles. You can see the public housing layer that's in there. And then basically where police stopped them before the injunction started, and then where they stopped after the injunction, which is blue before and the red triangles afterwards. So again, just trying to make everything easy so that when you're looking at it, even though there's a lot there, you can hopefully have the viewer look at it and get a sense of what's going on. So. All right, so I alluded to this earlier. One of the really cool things you can kind of play around with ARC is mapping the social and spatial relationships. So, so if you look here on the left, the sociogram, the kind of the white and blue lined image there, that is the 31 gangs in Hollenbeck. That is their rivalry network. So what that means is every connection from one node to another, from one gang to another, that means they don't like each other, right? That means they fight, right? If you were to walk into the other person's turf, there's a good likelihood that you would get attacked, right? And so you kind of look at that, and it's really cool. Just like that alone is really like a really cool thing to kind of understand these relationships between these groups, right? And you kind of show that to people, and you're like, wow, that's really cool. Well, one of the things that comes up right away, is like, well, why are there these kind of node points where, if you look at this, there's kind of like three clusters, right? You kind of have a group on top, you have this big group in the middle, and then this group at the bottom. And you're like, why doesn't, like, for instance, like State Street, like, why don't they beef with Eastlake? Like, it seems like they're not that far away. But when you actually take that and map it, right? So in ARC, what you can do is you can get the centroid point of any polygon, and then you can actually have, I forget the tool to do it because it's been a while, but you can actually get ARC to connect lines between each centroid point. And so it'll then draw essentially the sociogram, it'll draw it in space. And so you can actually see what that translates to in space here. And so when you're looking at this, the sociogram kind of in space, you can see that the reason why you kind of have these clusters is that you have major highways that dissect where those kind of node points are, right? So at the bottom, you have that little like pentagram triangle star, right? With White Fence. Well, there's a highway that cuts off right in the middle of White Fence's turf. And so they become the only connecting point, right? The gangs aren't traveling down past that highway. If you're Tiny Boys or Breed Street, you're not going down to Beanie. You're not going down to A Street. Like it's too much effort to get there. Same thing going north. Big Hazard's actually a real big linchpin because to the south of them, you have a major highway. To the north of them, you have a railway area. And actually to the east of them, you have kind of railway and you're kind of moving into the county line. So there is some relationships with county gangs, but it's not quite as directed as being in the division. And even though you can't see here, to the west of Big Hazard, that's actually where USC Medical Center's at. And so there's a kind of like, it just kind of has this big kind of capsulization of kind of locking them out. So again, you can't kind of see. And the other thing too, if we were to go back a couple maps where we had the elevation, the gangs in the south there from Big Hazard down is all very relatively flat. It's a little rolly, but it's pretty flat and very grid-like. When you go north, it becomes very hilly and mountainous. And so actually the gangs kind of break up more because there's actually hills and valleys in between some of those gangs, right? So again, when you're kind of looking here, why they're not quite touching or whatnot, like part of that is the actual physical terrain is prohibiting them from beefing. And you can't quite see here, but like 14, there's this little gang called Highlands. And it's just it's not a cul-de-sac, but it's like a curved through street. And again, you're looking next to them, you're like, well, why in the world does this little gang exist compared to El Sereno, which is this massively big gang around it? Well, it's because they control the access points into their neighborhood. So like if you're gonna get in from one side and they don't know you, you're gonna get shot at. And the physical terrain around them is basically on the backside of those houses, it's a giant ravine. And so like, even those two gangs abut each other, right? When you're looking at this map, if you actually have the elevation map in there, you'd see that like they're pretty protected. And like this isn't, it's not Normandy where you're like people are scaling the mountainside, right? Like it's gang members they're not doing that. So anyways, this is just kind of a neat way of taking these two things, because again, gangs don't exist in vacuum. They do have this social relationship that we have to kind of acknowledge too. So, all right, so that's kind of stuff specifically I've kind of done maps I've done with Hollenbeck for the most part. Kind of just looking broader at kind of some things with data that you can just easily download and use instead of having necessarily create things. Again, this is kind of just looking at a comparison of gang crimes from 2000, 2012, but this is for the entire city of LA. So again, if you're not familiar with Los Angeles, I tell people it kind of looks like Swiss cheese. And the interesting thing, well, kind of like why it kind of looks like Swiss cheese. So if you're looking, particularly in the green, so the West Bureau, you can kind of see like there's these holes, right? Those holes are independent cities. So when LA was actually formed, if an area had a well and didn't have to tap into the LA water grid, then they were able to remain autonomous. So the bottom, the kind of the area between the green and the purple there, that's Culver City. If you go to the left of there, we can kind of see the water inlet. That's what is that? I don't know what that one is. You go up above it, that's Santa Monica. And then the other kind of big hole there in the middle, that's Beverly Hills. So each of those have their own police department. They're autonomous. They're not tied into the city of LA. The top one up in the valley, that's San Fernando, the little square up there. And then again, kind of looking south, you're thinking like, why in the world does Los Angeles why is there like this like weird line going down to the waterfront? But like obviously at some point LA wanted all the revenue for a port, and so That's the port of Los Angeles, which is actually right next to the port of Long Beach, which is a bigger port. But basically that little stretch there that goes down is just a highway, right? Like it's just like this little artery line so they could connect to the harbor so they can get tax dollars. But again, this just kind of shows you the breakdown by bureau, with each of the little units there being reporting districts. Reporting districts are basically 2,000 census tracts. So again, they're pretty easy to visualize, but it's just the total number of crimes in those reporting districts, and then shaded, right? With, again, trying to make sure that you're using the same cut points for both maps. So again, you can kind of get a sense of where things are at. So I always ask students because I use this map I showed in other classes when I'm talking about crime patterns or whatnot. Can any of you tell me what's the recurring theme that you see between these two maps? Is there anything that you can tell me that seems to be similar?
Bueller? Anyone out there? Come on.
Grant will give you 10 extra credit points if you get it correctly. No, I don't.
I'm game for that. Why not?
The South Bureau looks like popular on both sides for gang crime.
Yeah. So so again, 2000 is kind of right when the crime patterns that were getting to a point where they had this massive drop. But yeah, I mean, if you look at where the crime is occurring, South Bureau, right, particularly kind of the top part of South Bureau, between the purple and the red. So that area is considered South Central. If you're not familiar with LA. But yeah, it's still kind of concentrated in those areas. So granted, the crime has come down, right? We have a lot less crime, a lot less gang crime, but generally where gang crime was occurring before, it's still occurring today, right? Like we haven't dealt with the structural issues of what's causing that crime there, right? It's still happening, right? If you look at like West Bureau, right, by the ocean, like a lot of those places aren't having any gang crime, right? Like they still don't have any gang crime today, right? So again, yeah, that's kind of the thing. It's like, again, we have a lot less, but it's still kind of happening in those same places. And just kind of another way of looking at this. So this is just a zoomed in version of Hollenbeck. And again, you can kind of see the same thing, right? We have a lot less, but overall it's still kind of in those areas that kind of are seeing it before, it dissipates and changes, but generally the same place. So kind of moving on. So I'll talk about a couple, just kind of, I won't get into the details, but just a couple papers kind of looking at and using some of this data just to kind of look at trends and patterns with stuff. And also I kind of just want to highlight that once you make a really good map for an area, if you're using data at an area and you end up doing some research in those places, it's really great to have templates made. So that way you can just kind of plug in new things into that map, and it makes it really easy for you to participate in research and do things, and it doesn't necessarily eat up all of your life doing it, because I'm sure that you guys have found out doing stuff, when it comes to making the map look pretty, it can absorb a lot of your time and energy. And then if you forget to save it, or something goes wrong, or you have to add a layer back in, you have to start all over, and it just gets monotonous and tedious and tiring. And so I usually try to have things saved or whatever. So this is just an example. This is actually, according to Jerry Radcliffe, this is a horrible map. He had lots of negative things to say on Twitter about this map, but I was not trying to go for all the bells and whistles here, but it just, in hindsight, now I know I have to make things better. And so you'll see nicer maps as we progress through here. But this was kind of looking at patterns of gang violence over time. So we have a lot of knowledge about gang violence, but there's not really much literature tracing it over time because it's difficult to have those records, right? Police don't generally keep the best records sometimes of stuff over time, let alone make it accessible. So again, like I said, when I was in Hollenbeck, I was collecting homicide data. Just so happened that they also had homicide log books that they didn't have, you don't have the giant binder of homicides that would tell you like all the details in it, but they'd have a binder that would basically have the basic information of what happened, right? So you could at least kind of get a sense, okay, was it gang related? Was it not? Who was involved? Weapon, some basic things like that. And so again, having at least the spatial data, there's something you can do with that. So I was basically able to get data from 1978 to 2012. And so working with my colleagues here, we kind of looked at these patterns over time. My colleague Mike Barton here knows a lot of stuff with modeling stuff across time with kind of his research on gentrification. And so we were able to just kind of look at these patterns over time. And again, part of the tough thing here is your N. There's only about 50 census tracts, RDs in Hollenbeck. And so again, when you have 4 time periods, you're up to 200. So that's a decent enough sample to be confident with. But again, it gets tough if you're only looking at one, if you're just going to run one time period, right? So you kind of have to really kind of look at these things over time if you can to get something meaningful. So anyways, the big takeaway here, looking at gang, which is on the left versus non-gang, is that, again, from the 1980 to 2010, we're generally seeing a decrease. With the gang stuff, we only saw a significant decrease from the 1980 time period to the 2010. 1990, 2000, were basically, there was no difference going on. The non-gang, you can see there is quite a significant difference happening. Here we were looking at kind of the structural characteristics of those communities. So like typical census variables, like so concentrated disadvantage, which is a variable that gets made up of like percent unemployment, percent below the poverty line, percent female-headed households, right? Things like that kind of form that construct. So that ended up being a big feature that mattered. So it didn't really matter across time if you're in a neighborhood, right, that has a lot of disadvantage, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to have gang violence there. The other big thing that stands out here was the spatial dependence. That gang crime has this spatial component. It clusters in certain areas where the non-gang didn't have that feature, which again, we would kind of expect that, right? I mean, non-gang violence includes lots of different things. There's no reason to necessarily think that it has a spatial component, right? Domestic violence, why would that have a spatial dependency for where all the domestic violence happens, right? It's not like all the domestic violence people live in the same community, right? They're interspersed throughout an area. So that was the kind of the first study we kind of did looking at this. We built off of this, looking at a different way, because again, trying to understand that pattern, one of the things that has come out was this idea of, again, of understanding gentrification. So like I said, my buddy Mike studies gentrification. There's a couple famous papers by Andy Papachristos looking at Chicago and gentrification and crime. His one student, Chris Smith, she came out with a paper looking at gentrification and gang violence. And so, again, they have a much bigger sample to kind of play with. But again, they were, again, trying to understand these dynamics. And they found that they were kind of looking at state gentrification, which is like the tearing down of housing projects, versus private gentrification, which would be like the influx of businesses, which they famously use coffee houses. So that becomes the big metric they use. But again, you could think of other things that could be used for that. And they basically find that if it's, if I remember correctly, if it was like state gentrification, it had a negative, it had a violence, it didn't impact violence, but if you had private investment, you had less gang violence, is what I think they found. And so we kind of try to do the same thing here in Hollenbeck, kind of looking at gentrification just in general. So there's a couple other papers. Gentrification is a really messy term, I found out. So we like saying it and using it, but like how it gets measured is like whatever you feel like in the morning, right? Like it just changes by researcher. There's no uniform way of doing it. It's a whole mess. And like Mike has swore me several times, like, I'm not studying this anymore. I'm not studying this anymore. But you know, it keeps pulling them back. But it's a really messy thing to do. So anyways, we used a measure that another paper used for Los Angeles. And here you can kind of see there's several tracks that you have gentrification. So again, we're looking at changes from decades. So it's changes from 1980 to 1990, changes from 1990 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2010, right? So you can kind of get a sense here of those shifts of what became gentrified when. And then again, you can kind of see the public housing. So we did have one area that gentrified in the 90s when that public housing area was torn down and redone. So we have a little bit of, you could say you have a little bit of both. We have some private investment, we have some state. And basically with this, we find kind of the opposite of what they found in Chicago, that basically gentrification had no effect on gang homicide, did not do anything to it. But it did reduce, or it did have a positive association with non-gang homicide. So non-gang homicide actually went up in those gentrified areas, right? And so you might be thinking, well, why is that? Why would non-gang violence go up, right? Well, you know, that violence could be a result of other crimes, right? So maybe can you have nicer stuff, nicer people moving in? Maybe there's burglaries that go awry. Maybe there's robberies that go awry that turn into violence. Again, kind of the interesting fact here again that gang violence didn't go down goes back to this notion again that these gangs are so tied to these communities that it doesn't really matter what you do to change it. Members are still coming back to those areas, right? So again, just kind of seeing here. And again, this is a much nicer map, you know, than the last two. You can see I got the north arrow, got distance in here. I got a larger map. You can see where Hollenbeck's located to the rest of the city. Again, trying to take those things into context here. And then kind of moving on, I'm not going to get through all the get into the gritty here at the results, but another opportunity I ended up having, I took a risk terrain modeling class through Rutgers, which I know Grant has lots of experience with that. I'm not sure if you talked about that with them at all. No. So anyways, what risk terrain modeling does, you basically to this class, you learn how to use kind of the software to do the modeling with it. But basically what it allows you to do is look at features of the built environment or other features associated with the built environment. And you can basically put it into a model, and the computer is a lot smarter than me, right? It can basically figure out which features matter, right? So you figure out what's your outcome. Obviously we study crime or violence. So, and I'm interested in gangs, so I use that. But I mean, it could be anything. Like we could look at COVID infection rates, right? And see, is there some, based on where people get infected or something, or where you have some other health outcome, right? You could put that in as your outcome variable. It could be where you get speeding tickets, right? It could be anything, right? But kind of having the information I had, because I had some unique stuff with Hollenbeck, I thought, okay, well, I can bring in some of the built environment stuff, but I have all this other information. I have where gang members live in Hollenbeck. I have where gang members get stopped, so kind of where they're hanging out, where they're where those hangouts are, where they get stopped by police, right? I kind of have all this other information I can kind of bring in too and see, okay, what matters, right? What's interesting here? And so I ended up looking at both gang assaults and gang homicides. I ended up parsing the two out because I had different data, and I thought it would make kind of more sense to kind of keep them separate than combining them. But I mean, you could combine them. There's no reason why you can't. But what was kind of interesting keeping them separate was that the model ended up kind of producing two different results. And it, you know, again, when you start thinking about it and you kind of unpack the results after you get it, because it's like, it's great, the model does all the work for you and it tells you the answer, but then it's like, well, what does that mean, right? Like that's the big thing for us as criminologists is, okay, this is significant, it's important, but why? Like trying to think through that. And so, you know, you get the information from the RTM model, you can then map it. So if you look at the map there, you can get a sense of the dark blue are areas that are less risk of, in this case, a gang assault happening. The dark red areas are areas that are very high risk of a gang assault happening. And that is based on the features that the model has determined are important. And so for assaults, it ends up being where gang members get stopped by police, metro rail stations, and gang member residences. So what it is it's the combination of those three features. So the first two are proximity, so it's the distance from those, and you can kind of see on the tables how far that distance has to be, and then the density of gang member residences, right? So basically the more dense area where gang members live, and you're near a rail station, and you're near places where gang members are hanging out more frequently, there's a greater chance that that's going to be a really high risk area, and there's a greater chance of you experiencing a gang assault, right? Or witnessing one or just being there. So basically, after you can do all this, you do it, you run the model against 1 year of data, and then you can test it against a subsequent year of data to see how well your model actually does. For this, it did a really great job predicting it. So when you're looking at the map, those black dots are the year after the model. So the coloring is 2009 gang assaults, but the 2010 is what's displayed. And you can see the very last table, you can see that, again, the very high risk and medium risk, that the model's doing a really good job at. Those are areas that are very likely to have experienced a gang assault that following year. So the model did a really good job of saying that where we expect to see a gang assault happening, we actually experienced one. So again, this is a really great tool for policy and for policing, because again, if you know, if you run a model for a year and you know that these are areas that are problematic, then you can maybe deploy resources there and try to deal with those areas in some way. Or again, if these are areas that you know, for instance, again, rail stops, well, maybe we need to put up more cameras in those areas so we can see what's happening, right? And we can make it less attractive of locations. But again, what's interesting with all of these locations versus when we switch over to the homicide map here in a second is that all of these locations are kind of places where gang members are likely to run into each other, right? So they're kind of points where you might expect gang members to kind of bump into each other and have some type of negative interaction. Where when we go to the homicide one here, the two features of that are important, still gang member residencies, but the big one here that changed is gang set space. So those known gang locations, right? And the thinking here is, unlike maybe where gang members are getting stopped, as maybe some type of congregating area, or rail stations where, again, they might just run into each other using the rail system or crossing the roads or whatnot, is that these are places that gang members know where other gang members are generally, right? So they're actually going to those locations to target someone with violence, as opposed to violence just happening organically, let's say. But again, here, when you see the model, a little different patterning, right? As far as where those high-risk areas are located. And in this case, I think it's more attribution just to having a low N, right? So the bad thing about studying gangs in the early 2010s was that there's not a lot of gang violence anymore in Hollenbeck. So that's a good thing, because again, we don't like violence. But when you're studying violence, it's a bad thing because you need a bigger N. So it's this, Jekyll and Hyde type thing. But in this case, the model did not did not predict very well that that following year where those homicides were occurred. You can see they're kind of interplaced in some areas. And so again, it could just be the shortcomings of the model. It could be the fact that we just don't have a large enough N. I'm leaning more towards the latter, but again, as you can only kind of make so many suggestions. So again, if you had an area that had a large number of violence, more homicides, you might be able to get a better prediction with that. But again, just kind of shows you the differences here and those features of that built environment and how they actually differ. So I think it's really interesting because again, lots of times we kind of lump, violent crime together, we lump property crime together, we kind of treat them as this ubiquitous thing because it's easy to do, but thinking broader on those features and how they actually might contribute differently to different aspects of very similar types of crimes. So that's kind of some RTM stuff I did with Hollenbeck. Kind of moving away now from LA. A tool that I learned from my wife. So my wife is an archaeologist and does stuff with ARC, but in a much different medium and with much different things than me. She introduced me to this idea of geo referencing. So what geo referencing actually lets you do, which is kind of cool, is that it lets you take a TIFF or a JPEG, and you can actually stitch it into your data frame in ARC. And so if you have a historic map, you can actually stitch it into a current map you're looking at based on kind of a couple nodes on the corners, and then it makes it really easy for you to digitize what it is you're looking at, because you can basically kind of just trace over the feature, right? And so in this case, my wife and her family are from Toledo, Ohio, and the newspaper, the Toledo Blade, had asked the Toledo Police Department for their gang map because they were doing a story, and the Toledo Police Department said no, which I don't necessarily find surprising, but again, like they said no, and so they asked for a FOIA request. Toledo Police said no, so they took it to court. And so while that court battle was kind of going on, the Blade people actually went out and like interviewed residents, locals, and they came up with the map on the left-hand side there of the gang territories in Toledo. And so like then they published this in the newspaper, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. And being a graduate student who kind of sees that shiny new coin all the time and chases it, you're like, oh, what can I waste my life with for like a couple days? Oh, I'll go do this, right? So I ended up geo-referencing those images. So you can kind of see the big thing in the middle is that geo-referenced image, and then the polygons being formed on top of that. And then the map below that then is, if you get rid of that TIFF, that image, you can kind of see then what it looks like when you actually have those boundaries drawn on your own. So all those things correspond with the kind of the two images, because it's actually two different TIFFs that are geo-referenced here, right? So there's the bottom one, which is or the top one, which is the inlet of that kind of detailed area. It's actually in there in the middle. So again, it's really kind of a neat tool. I was telling Grant yesterday, like we don't, in our field, we don't use it a lot because we don't have a lot of historical criminology. But again, depending on things you're looking at, it could be really cool looking at patterns. Like I said, I have at the beginning of the slideshow, I had Chicago's gang map from 1928, early 1920s, and it'd be really cool if I had a year of my life, I could just sit down and like just digitize all of those things on a current map of Chicago. And I bet you anything that a lot of the gang activity from the 1920s, it's probably in the same locations it is today as it was back then. And that'd be a really easy way of kind of doing that comparison. It just takes a lot of time to obviously digitize those things. So again, just another example of things you can do. I'm not going to get into details here, but this is just another kind of RTM example. So when I ended up doing that class with Rutgers, it's kind of like you do everything on your own, but they provided a bunch of free data based on all the people that asked for data. And it just so happened someone asked for data in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And I was like, oh, I didn't ask for that, but I'll gladly use it. And so was able to kind of apply it to Baton Rouge. I had a student in my GIS class, and we had projects, just like you guys had projects. My students had projects, and they were working with the district attorney's office, and the district attorney was kind of getting not making headway with the resources that they wanted to use, and was trying to think of other ways of kind of dealing with crime issues. And so they were interested in understanding kind of the relationship with blighted properties. And so we ended up kind of taking that project and then putting this RTM framework on it later. And same thing, the areas that are most likely to experience violence in Baton Rouge are close to convenience stores and areas that have a dense area of blighted properties, right? So the map on the left there, you can kind of see that's the city of Baton Rouge, which is got really ugly boundaries. It's not clean cut at all. So for that, we just kind of looked at all the zip codes that kind of touch all of the city boundaries, because they're just so porous. You wouldn't have any idea if you're in or out of the city limits. And again, looking at those kind of built environment features, which again are the blighted properties and convenience stores. The map that's kind of below that then was, I ended up making it for someone else, but you can see all the green dots are the blighted properties. You can get a sense of just where those are located. The black dots then are the homicides, and kind of where that. So again, you just kind of get a sense of those high risk areas, and again, the kind of the clustering of those blighted properties. But again, just kind of showing you kind of ways of doing this. And in this one, I had inlets of 2 maps, because you can see not everyone might know where Baton Rouge is in relationship to everywhere else. So you can see a little zoomed in version of the city limits in relationship to the parish or the county that we live in. So you get a sense of where that's at, and then where that parish is located within the state of Louisiana. So just another kind of ways you can kind of play around with your map, again, of trying to show your reader where you're at or whatnot. Again, the comment I made before about having that template. So again, my buddy Mike was working on a project, needed a map for this kind of mural project that was going on. And I was like, hey, I got a map. It's like, all I gotta do is like take a couple things out and put a couple things in, and like, boom, it's ready to go, right? And so again, real easy to kind of jump on a project, help out with some what others might consider heavy lifting, but again, if you have the tools available, it doesn't take you very long and can help out. So again, this was just a project, kind of, they were looking at violence before and after kind of the establishment of some of these murals. And so again, just kind of where those murals are located in relationship to the city. So, and then kind of rounding things out now. So kind of my recent work is kind of moving into looking at far right groups, white power groups, and kind of rethinking them with a street gangs focus. So me and my colleague Shannon Reed, we have a book that just came out this past September. But again, trying to understand these things also with this spatial relationship with their activity. So these are just two different maps of kind of looking at the same thing. We end up going, the one in the book, which unfortunately is not colored. They didn't ask us if we wanted it colored. I guess they weren't going to pay the big dollars for that colored map, but you can see it here. So this is actually 2 data sources. It had data that was available, people that were using the Daily Stormer website, that people were able to, someone was able to track their IP address. And then there's a big data set that was released for another white power forum called Iron March, where a group Adam Waffen division kind of formed. But again, it had the IP addresses for all the major people that were participating on that. So you can just kind of get a sense of where these IP addresses actually exist in real life. So you can actually, there's some tools that can actually translate IP addresses into lat and longitude in a county. And so you just kind of allocate to the county level. And so the map on the left is just showing you yellow is Iron March, red is Daily Stormer, and black means it's a county that had activity. Someone was using both of those. So people were in those counties were using either, right? And so again, it's not saying that the same person was doing it or anything like that, but it's at least you're getting a sense of kind of where these things are. And to me, again, you kind of look at it and it's like, you don't really see many patterns, but I think that's kind of the point here is that individuals that are engaging in these forums aren't in any one place. It's spread out across the country. It's a much bigger problem than just being a liberal city problem or a conservative state problem. Like it's lots of places, right? Obviously, you can see there's tends to be a lot more overlap in counties that are more urban locations. So if you kind of look at the other map, again, just another way of looking at it, again, it's a little bit tougher, but I tried to incorporate like a hash for where you had metro areas at. So if a county was considered a metropolitan location. But again, you're getting a lot of areas that, again, it's not just a urban phenomenon, it's also happening in other places. But trying to have a little more gradation of the amount of activity of each place. So again, just kind of different ways of showing that across the US. And then the last one I got for you is looking at Proud Boys. So that's one of the white power groups that kind of we consider to be like the archetype of an alt-right gang. This is just showing you where documented incidents of Proud Boys activity occurred from 2016 to 2019. And just, again, the size of the node is showing you how much activity. And then you can throw in a graph on your map there and you can show, again, those cities as far as the amount of activity, number of incidents that took place. So again, just a kind of another way of showing where these things are happening across the country. So with that, that's what I got. Just in case none of you are familiar with LSU, we do have a 500-pound tiger that lives on campus. So if you ever want to come to the zoo, he's got a very nice, don't have to feel bad for him. He's got a very nice enclosure. It's nicer than the tigers at the Baton Rouge Zoo. He's quite happy there. But if you guys ever need to reach out to me or have any questions in the future, feel free. Or if you have any questions now, I'd be happy to answer.